Pastor of 21 years. So I've been doing pastoral ministry in churches, West Virginia, Kentucky, and recently I did an interim pastorate in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio, serving a church there for a couple of years. So I've been pastoring for a couple decades now, and I love it. Some of my great passions, I love what happens in the classroom, I love teaching, and I love preaching, and I love them both. I really believe that what happens in the teaching and preaching moment, it affects people's lives. It affects the way they think, the way they frame their worlds, the way we shape and reshape communities. So I love teaching and preaching, not just for the performance, but more so what it does. And I've seen what it does. I've experienced it in my own life. I've experienced it in my preaching. I know that you can preach a sermon that you think you've totally missed it, and someone can come up to you the next week, and this is not some story that I'm making up. It actually happened, and say that I was off my medicine. I'd stopped going to therapy and was considering suicide. And I heard you preach on the book of Job and decided, that I was going to get back on my meds and get back in therapy. And this person's still in church, going strong today. So preaching makes a big difference. But I think what I love most about the church is the fellowship. People. I love people. I'm a people person. I love what happens outside of the sanctuary. I love what happens in the fellowship hall, outside the. I love what the church symbolizes and represents in the community. So it's something that I've always enjoyed and will continue to enjoy for years to come. Well, I think I'll go back to when I was 7 years old in a Pentecostal Holiness Church in Kimball, West Virginia. And I remember the pastor of the church, who was my uncle, was preaching the gospel. It was Good Friday, a couple days before Easter. And my parents were both ministers, but did not push their faith on us. Whenever our time came, it was our decision what we wanted to do, even though we were going to be in church, but that's beside the point. At different times over the past few years, some of my siblings and cousins had made a decision for Christ, but I never felt compelled to. But I do remember that night him, preaching and talking about God's love and how to experience God's love in Jesus Christ. And at the age of 7, on that Good Friday, I got out of my seat and I walked down the aisle, and you know how they do, they put the mic up in your face, and I told people I wanted to be a Christian, and I was serious about that. I'll never forget that Easter morning of stepping into that cold baptism and what I felt as I was surrounded by family and friends who were all there to witness that special moment of knowing that that was a decision I made, and a decision that has profoundly shaped my life and affected my life. And my mother is a preacher of over 40 years. And seeing her preach and minister many times in churches that were very, let's say, how should I say it, not always open to the gifts and graces of women in ministry. And my mother would just preach and minister anyway. And to see people's lives changed, people who have, when she starts preaching, they have this sort of wall up. But the more she preaches, and when they come to the realization that the same God that called men to preach, it called her to preach, and the same God that anointed men to preach, anointed her to preach as well. And to see liberation happen before my very eyes at a young age, it's something that will always stick with me as well. I'm a bit unorthodox. I'm Pentecostal to my core, even though I'm dually ordained both as a Pentecostal and a Baptist minister. But in the Pentecostal tradition, you have to have a word from the Lord. So your spiritual life, your devotional life, your walk with God, both personally and as a minister, is very, very important. So when I accepted a call to preach at the age of 19, I was just writing. God took me, I was just an average student, B's and C's. I graduated right in the middle of my class in high school. First 2 years of college was nothing to sneeze at, to say the least. But something happened. My freshman year of college changed my life. My mind has been on fire ever since. So I study all the time, and I write. And my dad was walking down the steps one time, and he just stopped. He said, "Son, I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to ever forget this." He said, "Anytime you feel God has laid something on your heart," he said, "you write it down so that you won't forget it." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You hear me?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And that has been a practice that has stuck with me to this day. So I have boxes of just notebooks where I'm always journaling, always thinking, writing, studying, thinking, writing, studying, both about my life, about Scripture, what's going on in the world, and out of that reservoir, in prayer, I draw a lot of my sermons. Now, the benefits of theological education and having your training as an exegete, training in preaching, it just gives me the tools to be able to do so many different things. So, and I would much rather have both than one or the other. So I preached about a decade where it was just, this is what you feel God has laid on your heart. Yeah, you study that, and that's great, but there was a lot I couldn't do and I wasn't able to do because I didn't have the skills and the tools and the training to be able to do that. And I have that now, which makes preaching that much more enjoyable, but it requires preparation, it requires the hard work, but it's a labor of love for me. So what I do is I bring together what's coming out of my devotional life, my prayer life, and my concern as a pastoral leader for about 2 decades. And then I bring that together with these skills of how to work with the Greek text, how to exegete a passage, how to contextualize a passage, how to lift up from a passage what is relevant, what sort of fits the word. And being a good Pentecostal, the Spirit is very much part of this whole process in sort of bringing all of this together. So I make sure I do my part and study and prepare and put sermons together. Many times I put sermons together, and I'm not lying, weeks, months, and sometimes years in advance. So this Sunday I'm preaching in Durham, North Carolina at a Pentecostal church. And I'm preaching a sermon that I've been thinking about for about 3 years. So this is something that I've been writing about, thinking about, and I put it away, come back to it. So it's a constant process of doing both and once I sort of get a sermon in the sort of final form, then I spend some time thinking about the sort of sermonic moves that I want to make and internalizing that sermon, so that you own the word, so that you're not up there sort of reading it, but you're able to yield yourself fully to the Spirit in the preaching moment. And I'm a student and a practitioner of the black preaching tradition, which itself is a wonderful part of the black church tradition. The kind of creativity, the room for where spontaneity and preparation comes together, and the preaching moment is communal. I love that, and I love what God does with that moment. And I'm comfortable in that moment. Comfortable both with very serious issues, but then also laughing with the church as we wrestle with the text. And issues that text brings to us. So I could go on, but I won't. It's a very interesting story. I grew up in a big family, 6 sisters. I'm the only boy. I have 3 older sisters, 3 younger sisters. So
you're right in the middle.
I know what it's like to be picked on. But good parents. I was raised in the church. Mm-hmm. My dad was a foreman in the mines for about the first 7 years of my life. And so
coal mines
in Southwest Virginia. Very poor. So I grew up, even though for those first 7 years my dad was a foreman. And so in our neighborhood we were one of the more well-to-do families. But by the late 70s, things were changing in the mining industry. There were an increasing number of accidents and deaths, and my dad saw the handwriting on the wall, and he made the most difficult and the most important move of our lives to this day, and he got us out of Southwest Virginia and moved us to across the state line into Virginia, and he drove a trash truck for the next decade. And so we spent that decade in the projects, very poor. We were on food stamps. We were in the peanut butter cheese line, getting the government rations and the various programs and things that they had. And that had a profound effect upon us. We were often ashamed. And what poverty does to you psychologically is something that I live with to this day. But we grew up with a strong faith and a strong work ethic. And all of my siblings, except for one, has graduated from college. 4 of us have a master's degree. 2 of us have doctorate degrees, and one more is getting ready to get her doctorate degree. So this sort of difficult background with the faith foundation is fuel in my tank. Because of all of my friends that I used to hang out with for that decade, I was the only one to get out. A lot of them are in jail. Some of them are dead. Some of them are still in that difficult system. And while I'm happy and thankful that I made it out, I know that the chances of you getting out is pretty slim. After about a decade, we were able to move out of the projects and to get a house outside of town in the suburbs. It was a miracle. But a lot of people don't get out of that difficult system. So when I get to high school, it's a difficult time because, you're kind of ashamed that you're poor, but even though you've moved out of the projects with a family of our size, we're still poor. There was barely enough food for all of us to eat, family of our size. And so it was a blessing that friends and neighbors would let you come over. And I would conveniently plan to drop by and play basketball around dinner time. and they were gracious and kind. But it does something to you psychologically when you don't have enough. But we're living in the suburbs, we're in a nice house, so you try to put this front on like the things are better than they really are. So I found myself trying to distance myself from being poor and black. So I went through this period where I thought being a Republican was going to be my path to the presidency. So before there was Obama, there was going to be me, before God decided to take me in another direction. And so I really lined myself up with these kind of Republican values, pulling yourself up by your own bootstrap, and being conservative, and morals and ethics, and all these kinds of things. And this was right around the early 90s. during Bush Senior's presidency. So it's when I was sort of coming of age with my wanting to go in that route. And I sort of followed along that line. I was a pastor in a very conservative Pentecostal denomination. It fit with my political views, fit right in line with the church tradition I was ministering in. And that went for a few years until I came to Louisville Seminary after about 10 years of being a pastor and a minister. And I had never read a book by an African American. Now, I'd read plenty of books all through high school, advanced high school studies. I went to college for a couple of years and was a profuse reader as a pastor. And we have our own ordination track, and so it's not like you preach and they give you an ordination certificate. I mean, you do have to study, and I have studied and read ever since I accepted a call into ministry when I was 19 years old. But I never read a book by a black person, and so I was introduced to black scholars and black authors here at Louisville Seminary, and Stephen Ray had a profound impact on my life because Steve really insisted that you need to read books and you need to think about issues. You need to think about them from the black experience. You need African Americans you need to be in conversation with African Americans. You need to think about black people's issues and not just white people framing theological issues as if they're for everybody, because they're not. And I thought when we're talking about God, there's only one way to do that. But I was sort of introduced to a complex way of looking at history here at the seminary too, looking at it from a contextual standpoint. That if you're going to talk about theology, you're going to talk about history, first question you need to ask is who's doing the talking and where are they coming from? Okay, because it's a very important fact. So context was very important, and Steve was very, very helpful and jarring during my time. It was the first time I was reading what black people think about God and how slavery and racism affects black people. And so I had an aha moment in a theology class, listening to a lecture on the Bible and slavery. And that was a turning point in my life. I had read through the Bible multiple times, had preached well over a decade, had read over countless passages talking about slaves, and even text that says, slaves, obey your masters. Mm-hmm. And I never, ever made the connection between slavery in the Bible and the experience of slavery by African Americans. Never made that connection. And the experience of slavery is still to this day, I think, the greatest influence upon the African American community. We were enslaved for over 2 centuries and spent another 100 plus years with a different form of slavery. So we're just barely a generation past this in 2014. So you don't undo all of that. And the more you understand it, the more you understand just how complex slavery really is and how it continues to impact us. So God tapped me on the shoulder in that class, and I decided to write a thesis on it. And that was a preliminary way to try to think through some of these issues, because I could not accept that the Bible could endorse slavery, or that you could legitimately interpret the Bible in a way to support slavery. So I wrote a thesis. Well, to be a scholar of the church, it's a calling. you would think it's something that you choose to do, but I think I've been called to be a scholar for quite some time. It took me well over a decade to grow into this calling. The nature of the call of God is that yes, you choose it. The volition is very important. You want to do this. But there's also a sense of responsibility and obligation, because the nature of the call is that it is going to be difficult. And so I want to parse a little bit of what you've asked. I'm not just a scholar of the church, but I'm a particular kind of scholar. I'm a scholar of the black church. And to be a scholar of the black church is to be both celebrated, but also unappreciated. They celebrate you because you're an African American with a PhD, and the church takes black people, they take a lot of pride in that. So when I graduated with my PhD, there were people who were just genuinely happy. Here's a black person who's made it. But when you open your mouth and start asking questions and challenging not just the white institutional order, but when you start challenging the way we do church, the way we think about God, the way we do community, assessing our willingness to engage in important social issues, that leads to quite a bit of isolation. So it's hard work. I feel called to it. I love the church. If I didn't feel called to it, and if I didn't love the church, it would be easy to become, I guess, to write the church off and to become disengaged. I constantly come back to it because it's a sense of call, and I love it. But you know, there's a sort of pastor's network that when you're just a pastor that you're a part of, you get to go out to lunches, you know, what you preach on, how are things going at your church, and there's collegiality, there's support, you know, there's love, there's respect, there's appreciation, and that's wonderful. But when you feel that you're both a pastor but also a scholar, it's been very surprising to me, the calls you don't get, the doors that are closed. You would think that the PhD and becoming a scholar is going to open up a lot of doors in the church, but that's not always the case. So I've been a student of the history of the black church for quite some time. One of the most interesting facts I always like to introduce to my students when they're thinking about the black church and deep theological questions. So the first enslaved Africans showed up here. It's debated 1619, 1621, 1623. Sometime for about the first 100 years, enslaved Africans were not catechized. The church would not evangelize, they would not preach to them, they would not try to instruct them, disciple them. For various reasons, they didn't believe they had souls. But an overriding concern was this fear that if they introduce enslaved Africans to the Christian faith, if they come to experience God, they will be dissatisfied with being slaves. So I always tell my students, if you're going to talk about the black church, you have to get this sort of denominational framework out of your head. Because the genesis of the black church was that there was about a 100-year period where enslaved Africans were not allowed to be introduced to the Christian faith. And I said, so, number one, what does that mean to be in the church? Secondly, what does that mean theologically? Particularly as it relates to your understanding of salvation, okay? And if a person has to make a quote-unquote decision, and that's the only way they can experience the grace of God in Jesus Christ, then what do you do with that 100-year period when they were not even allowed to hear the gospel. And the people who were so-called Christians made the intentional choice to withhold the gospel from them. So that 100-year period calls for a lot of wrestling as to your whole understanding of what it means to be the church, which is why you have to have a large lens as it relates to your understanding of God, a smaller lens when you start talking about your understanding of the particularities of church and the church tradition. So we sort of start with that, and it gets quiet in the classroom on those points, because it was quiet in the library as I was reading this and wrestling with it. But being a good Pentecostal, we're always talking about the Spirit. And the work of the Spirit really is an interesting part of our history. That while the institution and the system was doing all that it can to keep them from experiencing God, our ancestors encountered God anyway. So we have a tradition of resilience, of creativity, of being claimed by God, of experiencing God outside of a religion that's being used as a social control. So the masters could talk about God. Enslaved Africans they knew God. They were experiencing God. They went out to the bushes. Sometimes after working 12 hours, I spent a couple of weekends in graduate school just reading slave narratives and reading how after all they went through, how worship for them was a place of refuge. It was a place of peace, a place where they could experience community, and a place where they could be somebody. And sometimes they would have to work. Then they would have to go to the master's church. This is after the 100 years. Now, once there eventually came a time where they said, well, if we want to make them good slaves, then we need to catechize them. We'll teach them how to be good slaves. And so they would go through various verses in the Bible and pull verses out of context and try to say, if you be a good slave, God will bless you. When you get to heaven, you'll be white, or you'll get your reward then. But right now, your lot is to be a good slave. You're predestined to do it. So they would sit through that. Sometimes they would just get up and walk out, but they would sit through it. On top of that, then they would go amongst themselves, and they would experience and worship God and take the bits of scripture that they heard and weave it together into this wonderful tradition we call the Negro spirituals. Rich, rich, rich traditions. Then after the awakenings, they begin to move into congregations. You have the first black churches were called African churches. And then after that second great awakening, they really start blowing into Baptist and Methodist traditions. But their issue was slavery. And that was their foremost issue that they were wrestling with. Did God ordain slavery? Their answer was no. Some black churches, not all, some black churches were very active in the abolitionist movement. And so it sort of gives rise to what historians refer to as this prophetic tradition within the black church that's always kicking against systemic racism, working to affect change it to make things better for all African Americans, and working with whoever they need to work with to make that happen. But this prophetic tradition is not the only tradition in the black church. There is this sort of tradition in the black church that is focused on doctrinal issues, and they sort of align themselves with their either conservative or liberal white Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever counterparts, and they're sort of right in line with those, with their white counterparts. And those theological concerns then become their theological concerns. But what happens when during Reconstruction is, of course, it's urbanization. You take about 90% of the black population was all in the South. They all started heading north, heading into these major urban centers. And there's a piece to the black church narrative that's not often told. There was a lot of classism. That when the blacks from the South started heading into these urban centers, the black church was not a welcoming place. So there was a lot of resistance and kickback, and about a good 5 decades of, I think, of lots of tension and debate going on in black communities about what it means to be black and what to do with the church. I think there are a lot of positive signs that the black church will remain strong and viable for years to come. Some studies have come out, and the studies have shown that of all the demographics, African Americans still are pretty highly churched. That there's a willingness and a continual engagement with the black church. It's not what it was 50 years ago, but there's still a continued engagement with the church. If you watch movies with African American actors, you can hear echoes of the church in almost everything that they do. So the influence is there. I think that is very positive. It proves that the black church still has quite a bit of influence. So that's all to the good. There are a lot of African American churches across this country, and these churches are the backbones of their community. And the pastors are doing great work, not only within the congregation, preaching and teaching, strengthening families, strengthening people's lives. And they're working in their communities. Very, very positive. And these churches are not just preaching, they're doing community development, they're helping people with housing, they're raising awareness about issues like voting, education, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, sexuality, you name it. These congregations are right in the middle of it, and that's very positive. So I want to lift up that it's not all bad. We have some fantastic models across this country of what it means to do church. But there's also great cause for concern. And I think that, number one, the average age of megachurch pastors is close to 60. We're getting ready in the next decade or two to see quite a bit of transition with leadership. And the signs are not looking good. We've seen some megachurches go through leadership transition, and it's been difficult because within these large churches, the influence of the pastor is a significant factor. In fact, the pastor is probably the sort of organizing center of what happens in that church. And so if you take this person out, what's going to happen? I think that's going to be a major issue. There are some health and trust issues going on with churches and pastors, particularly clergy sexual misconduct, which is a major issue in the black church that no one wants to talk about, that's undermining people's trust in what happens, and people, particularly women, do not always feel safe in congregations. That's been one of the most difficult issues that I've had to deal with working with black clergy, being an educator in a theological seminary. Is when you hear your sisters in ministry talk about their experiences of abuse and not feeling safe in churches. It's been difficult. So I really try to work hard in both raising awareness and also working with people who've been victims, and encouraging them find some appropriate channels to work through some of those issues and to understand that there are some churches where they can be safe. But I do think we need to flag that if we don't make some substantive changes around accountability and trust and safety, that it'll continue to undermine the influence of the black church, which historically has been strong. Another issue I want to flag is we really need to take up some of these critical community issues. I mean, in every black community, there are churches on every corner. It's the same here in Louisville. But what's happening within the four walls of the church does not translate to change outside of the four walls of the church. So you have all these churches and communities that are violent, impoverished, you name it, it's going on. But if you step inside the four walls, it's good church. We have good church, it's good singing, it's good preaching, you know, you feel good. But it doesn't do anything outside of the four walls. To me, that is a major paradigm shift that has to happen if the black church is going to remain viable. I fear it's not going to happen because the signs is that we don't have the leadership to make that happen. I'm working hard to model and to train and to mentor different kind of pastoral leaders to go out and to do that work. But it needs to be a paradigm shift. We need a lot of schools on board to really follow the push of black church leaders across the country who are encouraging more folks to get theological training. They need to get the right kind of theological training, and we need to change the paradigm that what it means to do black church is not to be a good preacher, but it's to change our communities. And if you're not changing the community, what good is the preaching? I mean, anybody can carry on, and anyone trained in rhetoric can go through the motions. I don't think that's what it means to be faithful to the gospel, to go through the motions. Jesus was an effective preacher. Jesus was a change agent. And Jesus knew how to, when it was about the popularity, how to step back from that, because that's not what it was about in the first place. And I'm not sure if we have the leaders who have the integrity to step back from that and to say it's not about this, it's about what's going on outside of the church. Because if that doesn't change, there's something very shallow about what we're seeing on a lot of these television broadcasts with all the carrying on. Mm-hmm. We have to do something more substantive. And so those are some of the key issues that the contemporary black church we must take up.
I thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.